Awesome. So, hi everybody. Thank you guys so much for participating in our seminar facilitation today. We wish we could be presenting to you guys live, obviously, but we do love this opportunity to be able to connect with you guys virtually. So, my name is Martha.
I'm Maggie.
I'm Cecily.
I'm Jessica.
And the four of us today will be facilitating a semi-structured roundtable talk in this video today that speaks to our designated policy topic and the article that's been designated for us. We know that mental health is a very passionate topic, but just a gentle reminder to try and keep the focus on policy in regards to mental health and not so much on mental health, I guess, itself. We will be highlighting some of the main points of our article for you guys today, breaking down Bocce's WPR approach, as well as reviewing Chapter 6 of her text. We're going to make some connections to the ECEC sector and ending with some COVID considerations regarding policy. So Jess, if you want to take it away with some of the main points, you can go ahead with that.
All right, thanks, Martha. So when looking at the article, I found it very interesting. I think so when looking at like universal health care coverage policies, that was produced to look at what's now called Medicare, which was kind of a key point throughout the whole article. So it looks at people's ability to pay for one's health. As before Medicare, people were placed in purpose-built facilities such as asylums. So the Medicare Act also looked at what is deemed as medically necessary based on a set of principles. However, mental health needs to be considered as a medically necessary service under the Canadian Mental Health Act.
Jess, can I just add kind of to your point there that I think like kind of what Jess is saying is that a huge thing throughout the article was that ex-patients, families, and consumers and like stakeholders all within the mental health sector realize that this is like not just a medical issue. This is like deeply rooted in political change. I don't know if you guys thought that as well was a main point,
Oh,
but
absolutely.
Definitely.
yeah, that was one thing that really stood out to me. So that's kind of what, when you said that, Jess, I just wanted to jump in there, but yeah.
Go, Seth.
Oh, perfect. Well, thanks, Martha. Thanks, Jess. Something I noticed also similar to both Jess and Martha is that the federal government is the one that kind of funds the Medicare. However, it's up to the provincial governments to kind of make the decisions on where the funding goes, like what services are available. And something that really stood out to me was that these services differed province to province. So what was emphasized in Ontario varied in Quebec or Saskatchewan, which kind of is in a sense a bit like concerning because obviously these services are super important. So yeah, I found that to be something that I took away from the article.
Thanks, Seth. So when also looking further into the article, it talked about how there was a gap within the promise services within the community and the financial support to establish these services. So it is evident to see throughout the article that mental health care is underfunded. This also looks at when also looking at like deinstitutionalization, which was talked about throughout the article. It was a shift from closing down the long-stay psychiatric facilities and shifting people into the community. So many of the ex-patients had listed poverty as a problem after deinstitutionalization, which may be due to the fact that people who shared that they had a mental illness at a job opportunity were not given the job opportunity. That was kind of highlighted throughout the article, and I thought that was kind of like shocking, especially thinking about now, as well as people were being seen through the hospital as general health patients, so lacking the support of mental health patients specifically, and the universal healthcare system faced lots of new pressures. So there was also, oh, sorry, Maggie, go.
No, I was just gonna make a point about like how you're talking about all this, like putting the patients back out into the communities and stuff like that. It definitely, as reflected kind of in the article, and like just linking it back to like class with policies and stuff like that, it kind of shows also that there was a lack of policies being put in place before they put all these patients back out into the community, which definitely could have maybe avoided all of this talk of poverty and people not being able to get jobs and things like that. Maybe if there was more stricter policies put in place by federal or provincial governments, maybe we wouldn't have seen that as much when they started shutting down those institutions. So I just thought that was kind of a point to put in there.
Mm-hmm. And the support within the community.
Yeah.
Too. So there was also within the article, it touched a little bit about Indigenous and their mental health. So they were seen to fall to the bottom of the mental health lists, which left them to have to seek care in other places, or would only access care if it was a survey for a warrant. I think that was, yeah, those were kind of the main points that I pulled from the article, and I think we had kind of discussed about prior to this for sure.
I think speaking to the Indigenous aspect of it as well is the huge like shift from before those institutions and then like going to this new Medicare. It was so westernized. Like we even know that today, like how westernized our like medical system is, and especially in regards to mental health. Like I believe it was last year, like somebody did or even like earlier this semester, someone did a presentation, and like we know from our course that like the Indigenous populations like within Canada often believe in like this holistic approach, and that's obviously not very like prevalent in our medical system. I think it is improving, but yeah, I agree, Jess. I thought that was an interesting point. Before we move on, I also was just going to quickly add that it talked about Saskatchewan being like the pioneer of Medicare. And I thought that was really interesting because I think probably all of us thought, you know, it would have been Ontario or it would have been like British Columbia. So I don't know if like that plays a factor into it or like whatever, but I think that yeah, it was definitely interesting to see like Saskatchewan with like obviously less diversity, like less of a population, that they were the ones to kind of be the ones implementing this policy. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing the main points of the articles. Another thing that we kind of discussed through going through the article was the problem represented. Throughout the article, we kind of came to the problem represented to be as the Canadian government's specific definition of what medically necessary is under Canadian Health Act and Medicare is causing inadequate funding to services to aid those who require them, which leads me to believe that there is only like the governing voices being heard, because if you think about what they define as medically necessary, if you were to go and ask individuals, like if I were to ask Jessica what medically necessary is to her, and Maggie and Martha, you and myself, like we would all have different definitions. So for the government to kind of define medically necessary as one understanding is like obviously a problem. Yes.
That's just to go off of that really quick. I also find that like you pointing out that it's such a political kind of decision being made, like with this medically necessary, like how we kind of came to be with our WPR is just how like this funding that isn't being like given to the mental health like system, I guess, is kind of where all of the problems are starting to come from. So like if there was funding being given into that kind of sector, maybe we wouldn't see so many issues. So I feel like we kind of pulled that the funding is the bottom line issue as of right now. But like again, like that just reflects about how it's so political. Like it's not just about medical stuff, like it's such a political sector, and it's like that makes it really difficult. So yeah.
I think like looking at the article and stuff too, it kind of talked about how most people receive services within like private sector and through private counseling, which fell outside of like the list of medically necessary as well as more people were having to access care from their private insurance because it wasn't covered under Medicare. So this kind of all ties back to like the whole funding piece of it, I think, which that also, oh, sorry, go Seth.
Sorry, I was just gonna kind of say a piece off that is like, when I think about mental health and the article, it really talks about poverty and mental health kind of going hand in hand, and having to seek private insurance. Like, a lot of people in poverty may not have access to private insurance, kind of then leaving all of the financial kind of burden on them to access these services, which again is not really ideal.
I was gonna say that kind of like led me to the assumption too of leading them not to want to seek care because they're like having to pay with it through their private insurance, and like that's like just the funding not being there, so then they maybe are not wanting to seek it, is kind of what I thought about that. So when looking at some like voices who were not heard, I think it definitely was the mental health patients. Within the article, it kind of touches on how policy change did not did not kind of look at the ex-patient's experiences when like looking at the policies. I think also the hospital staff, like physicians and specialists. Go Seth.
Sorry, Jess. So actually in the article, it states that healthcare administrators had continued to express that sending patients to general practitioners would actually reduce the stigma and fear. However, the government is not listening to these and only taking their perspective into account when creating policies and making decisions that are affecting like national and provincial and municipal levels.
That's interesting. So then also like looking at like voices who were heard, I think definitely like the government, like we had kind of talked about like policy governments. And yeah, so then we also kind of looked at connecting it to chapter 6, which looks at the whole like health and well-being. So I think this really connected, like chapter 6 really connected well with our article, as it talks all about mental health and well-being and stuff. So within chapter 6, it kind of looks at health is understood as more than just the absence of disease. The term well-being is often used as a signal for more holistic understanding. So I think this connects to the article and the importance of understanding mental health and the policies that surround this and being able to best support the patients.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I also feel like it connected well with chapter 6 in the sense of Bocce spoke to 2 theoretical kind of paradigms, one being biomedical and one being social. And from reading the article, I understand that the government almost sees this as like, in a sense, a biomedical problem, not really a biomedical problem, but like they're trying to kind of fit it under that, where it's kind of both social and biomedical, like it's more than just a health issue. What do you guys kind of feel about that?
I think like there's like kind of what you're saying, Cecily, like there's so much research that like we know that it is obviously a medical issue, like the research supports it, like it's like brain imbalances, stuff like that. So like in regards to informing policy, the research is there. It needs to be a social and political change. Like we need to be able to change the mindset of policymakers, governments. We know what we believe in. Patients know what they believe in. And the research is there. So I agree, Cecily.
It's just such a leveled system, you know what I mean? Like there's the medical level, there's the social level, and then there's like the political level, and all three kind of almost need to be on the same page for policies to kind of actually start being put in place that are going to start helping patients and people who are like struggling or just have mental health in general. Like they definitely all need to work together instead of kind of one saying this, one saying this, and one saying this. It's definitely kind of becoming a confusing thing, and I think that's where there's these big gaps are kind of coming from.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's...
So now we're just gonna kind of talk about like the early years, kind of connecting it back to all that kind of stuff. So within the article, it was talking a lot about, obviously there's not specific examples of the early years within our document, but there was a lot of talk on early detection and how that's like almost a better result in outcomes for people with mental health issues. So that either being like their medical care, their independence, their employment, housing, or just social networks, kind of just how we were saying again, there's so many levels to it kind of thing. So in early detection, we also know in the early years is super key for detecting things in children as well, and just starting to intervene young, and that can kind of help to stop the issue of like this generational thing that we're kind of seeing. So there's like 28,000 children on the waiting list here in just Ontario. So that's not even Canada as a whole. But because of like what the federal government is kind of deeming as medically necessary, and therefore like not allowing things to be covered, like mental health to be covered under the Medicare, it's leaving children, like let alone adults, but also children, to not be able to access these services unless, again, kind of how we were talking before, if they are able to access this third-party insurance kind of thing, which for children, they're kind of left with the fact that they're relying on their parents. So if their parents don't have a third-party insurance, then children aren't going to be able to get those services. So it's too bad that it's kind of becoming a generational issue that if parents aren't kind of getting the help that they need or being able to kind of access that stuff for their children, then it's going to be a constant cycle, which is kind of unfortunate to hear. Jess?
I was just gonna say, I think like you make really good points, Maggie, and definitely to like the early intervention thing that you were talking about. I think that's kind of like really how it can help connect to the early years for sure. I think is beneficial.
Absolutely. No, it was a little challenging at first to kind of see that, but then once reading it, you kind of have to read in between the lines in the document. Sess?
I also find that, not that I'm diagnosing children or anything, but in my care, I see a lot more anxiety within children and whatnot. And so having those in place for children would definitely benefit them in transitioning even classrooms, like from infants to toddler classrooms, or
Absolutely.
Childcare. Like if you are going from childcare to school, like the anxiety that comes with that. And especially with COVID and whatnot now.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So yeah.
It's kind of looking at how like there's lots of policies in childcare, and we all kind of know that from working the field. Like they have books on books on books of policies, but it kind of starts to look down at like how many of those are for the children's mental health and like kind of what can be done for that kind of stuff. And then just kind of connecting it to some like documents. I was looking at how does learning happen. And one of the biggest things within the mental like well-being and just well-being in general kind of section was about how educators play this like really important roles within supporting children and like their mental health and their overall well-beings. That's kind of looking at things of like being aware and connecting with community resources that can provide information and services to children and their families. But again, we're coming back to that whole fact of if children aren't able to afford or access these services, then educators can't really play the role that they could for children and their mental health. And then just same thing with how like the most serious of illnesses can kind of continue into adulthood. So this is affecting like their functioning, their productivity, their like being able to kind of be in the community and healthy development for like next generations. So we definitely need to be looking at how it's really critical to start kind of closing these gaps in mental health for children so that we can kind of stop this generational issue that we're kind of seeing. So
thanks, Maggie. Kind of like when you were talking, like I was like thinking as well that like you said, the article doesn't necessarily speak to the children specifically. But we know from like the other research that we've been doing for this project, just how significantly underfunded children's mental health is, and that even Cecily was saying how it's like a lot of the money is federally provided, but then once provincial like jurisdictions do get the option, you know, to like put funding into children's services, it's often going into like education or like physical health treatments like cancer, which are obviously important, but we know how important mental health is, especially right now during COVID. So I'm kind of going off, Maggie, what you were saying about the ECEC sector. we can't neglect the mental health, obviously, of our caregivers either.
Yeah.
So if our like the ECEs aren't in the right mindset, we obviously know how that affects children day to day. So I know you guys are going to be talking about COVID considerations here in just a sec, but it has me like reflecting a lot on this pandemic right now. So the ECEs obviously were the first essential workers to go back to work once the reopenings happened. They also were some of the only ones still working because we had those emergency childcare centers. And one thing that's like really struck with me is how many like Facebook posts or like tweets and stuff I've seen from like practicing ECEs and like teachers, like registered ECEs, like just how their voices are not being reflected within like these new like policies and procedures for COVID. Like I know before COVID, it was interesting because the mental health of caregivers I felt still was not necessarily up to par. And one of my experiences when I first got hired at a childcare center, they said like, like we recognize like you might feel burnout, but like at max, like you could get like 15 minutes to step out in a day, but like maybe take them in like 5-minute intervals. And like obviously our goal is like not to be having to step out of the classroom. We want the days to like go by like smoothly, whatever, but like at what point like do we, have different policies or like make it longer so that if an ECE like needs a mental health break, like they can go do that freely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, S?
I kind of want to go off your point about like taking a 5-minute break and whatnot. I find that not explicitly to educators, but workplaces, there's, mental health days that you can take now that are in effect. However, I have spoken to people who are actually scared to call in and take a mental health day due to the stigma that's surrounded, like they're then looked at really differently at work. Or I know someone who's taken a leave for mental health and they return back to work and they are looked at completely different due to taking a leave for their mental health. And it's not a positive change when they go back. Like they're looked down upon now that they're ill or they're, incapable of working and fulfilling their job requirements and whatnot, which is really almost upsetting to me because this is something that is so necessary and shouldn't be kind of looked down upon.
Yeah,
I agree. I think it's a reflection for sure of like our society. Like we are scared of like how our bosses see us, how government sees us, like things like that. So like you're saying, Cecily, like if our voices like aren't being heard through like these policies for mental health breaks or in these COVID-19 policies, obviously like ECs are going to be be burnt out like so quickly by the end of this pandemic. Like I cannot imagine what the mental health sector looks like in a few months from now.
absolutely.
Definitely. I just wanted to kind of mention another point that Martha was talking about is I actually worked March of 2020 when everything shut down. I was one of the first people to get called in, and the overwhelming feeling and the anxiety that came with everything, like first of all, the initial going in and like the feeling of I'm now putting myself at risk, but I'm doing it because I care and because I want to be there. But then, we ended up going 3 months of emergency care. And by the end, we all needed a break because of, our mental state was just, it wasn't where it was when we initially had started because of all the pressure that's on us and just anxiety of meeting all of those kind of COVID requirements and as well as fulfilling all our job requirements and whatnot. So definitely important with emergency care as like and educators and whatnot. Thank you.
Definitely. On that note, we can kind of go into our COVID considerations since we were talking so much about how much COVID kind of has impacted all of us with our own mental health and things like that. So just when we were doing research for our seminar and stuff, I came across an awesome resource, which is called School Mental Health Ontario Resources, which is a website for educators, caregivers, and also children to kind of navigate through their mental health and like just being kind of in the current times of COVID-19. So it gives lots of questions that can be used like in person or online to kind of start having those conversations with children as parents or educators to kind of start like labeling those kinds of emotions and things like that. And same with like the same type of things for the children. There's different resources and activities for them to do to just start kind of being able to see what mental health looks like to them and being able to judge that just being as their own person. Because as educators and caregivers, I know it's really hard sometimes not to say like this child is feeling this way and this is what we kind of need to do. We need to remember that children are able to label their emotions and we need to be kind of listening for that. So this resource was super cool to kind of see how they were laying it out very personal for the children to be able to, but then for educators and parents to kind of just assist them in that kind of way. This resource is also going to be in one of our discussion questions. So you guys can obviously like see that later on.
Yeah, I definitely think COVID is going to have a huge influence on policies that are up and coming, you know, because there was an article that I read and it said that there is an increase with the pandemic on, you know, life-threatening diseases, and mental health is actually considered one of those. Which, like, although it may not, you know, when you initially think mental health may not sit with you that it is life-threatening, but it is, like, it affects you in so many ways. So yeah, like with COVID, I think there's definitely going to be huge changes within seeing it as primary health and kind of a secondary health policy. So
it'll be interesting to see how policies change once COVID kind of slows down and gives like those policymakers a chance to breathe and kind of see where mental health like policies will get altered and stuff like that. And hopefully it will be for the positive and they'll start kind of seeing the importance of it for sure.
Yeah. Actually, a statistic that I found was that mental health of healthcare workers post-SARS indicated that symptoms of post-traumatic stress and other mental illnesses can persist for up to 3 years after the end of a pandemic, which really sat with me because like I think about, you know, how I'm still feeling after working emergency care and how, you know, I got a little bit of a break, but then I jumped right back into it. And like I had to figure out ways to cope when I was on a little bit of a break from emergency care. Like I wasn't given services or there weren't like any that were provided to me and whatnot. So definitely think it's something that's needing more thought as we yeah.
Did anyone want to add any other points before we close?
I think like kind of just talking about COVID, there was one like really good article that I found under the College of Early Childhood Educators that recognized them as COVID-19 heroes. So I think like it would be super beneficial for you guys like to take a look at that. We are all COVID-19 like heroes, like those of us who have been working out in the field. And I also think it would obviously be a really good article for like policymakers to read themselves, because like we said, like the Facebook posts we've seen, like Cecily, like your experience working in emergency childcare, like there's just such like a gap between what the policies say and like what's realistic in these classrooms and for like the mental health of educators. So
absolutely,
we can post that probably like in our infographic or something, or maybe it'll be like under Tina's content. So yeah.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks for discussing this article, ladies. It was definitely an interesting one and definitely made me think a lot about this topic in regards to policy.
I agree.
And we'll have questions in the discussion board too for everyone to partake and kind of start having those conversations too. So it'll be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for viewing our video, everyone. And we look forward to your discussions on our discussion board.
Absolutely.
All right,
Bye.
bye.